Welcome to Beyond Words, previously known as the Global Novel Podcast, and we're exploring literature as a living archive of human experience. Today, I want to share with everybody Black Cherokee. This is a novel that just came out by the acclaimed Canadian author Antonio Michael Downing. It traces the layered inheritance of Black and Cherokee identity through the fictional life of a young girl, Ophelia Blue Rivers. The story is set in the historical town of Etsi, which confronts what the author calls America's two original sins, Black enslavement and Indigenous genocide. It invites readers to reflect on what happens when those histories meet in one body. For me, I was particularly drawn to how the novel processes historical and intergenerational wounds, and what literature means in this context for collective healing. I'm having the author right here with me. Hi, Antonio. Welcome.
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for having me.
This is wonderful. I really enjoyed reading your novel. I know Black Cherokee is your second work after Saga Boy, which is actually a memoir. Is that right?
That's correct.
Black Cherokee is a very soul-touching story. Can you briefly let our listeners know what's it about? And why do you think it needs to be heard?
Well, Black Cherokee is the story, as you said, of Ophelia Blue Rivers, a young girl who we follow. We meet when she's 7 and we leave when she's 19. So it's a coming-of-age story. And just like the title suggests, she is both Black and Cherokee. So she has these two heritages. And she's born into a place that was a Cherokee reservation, but it's kind of been privatized. But her family has lived there for many, many years, many, many generations. And what happens to her, she gets rejected by both the Black folks in the area and the Cherokee folks. Basically, they're saying, look, you can't be both of those things. You have to be one of them. We don't understand you. And she has to kind of figure it out. Why I think this story should be out there is, first of all, it tells a little known history of how some of the tribes in the Southeast, which were sort of moved to Oklahoma and the infamous Trail of Tears, many of them owned slaves. Many of the wealthy folks in those tribes owned slaves. And I feel like most of our politics today are about who gets included and who gets excluded. Is an immigrant a real citizen? Is a trans person deserving of equal rights? Are Black people really full American citizens? And how do you feel belonging as a member of those communities? But also, what happens to us when we cut those people out and treat them differently, even though they're part of our community? So I feel like almost all our politics revolve around who's included and who's excluded. And that's kind of what Ophelia is experiencing and has to figure out as well.
Right. Well, the river in Black Cherokee is more than landscape. It feels like a living character because it nourishes, it remembers, and when it's poisoned, it exposes deeper fractures in the community, right? So how did you conceive of the river symbolically? Was it always meant to mirror the inherited trauma and contested belonging at the heart of the novel?
Well, yeah, and first of all, it's wonderful to be here, Claire. I've been listening to some of your previous episodes, and
Right.
it's just wonderful as a literature major myself to discuss the book in that context, because it's closest to how I experience it. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, the river is one of those things where if you're looking for the symbolism, you see it. But, if you don't see it, you don't see it. But the river is ever present. And it is, for me, the river represents time. It's, just like they say, the river is there, but you never step into the same river twice, because it's always moving and it comes from somewhere and it goes to somewhere. well, it's just like time.
Yeah.
And also in a deeper way for Grandma Blue and for Ophelia and her Grandma Blue, it represents the traditions and the old ways and the ancestors bestowing their gifts onto a new generation. And then that new generation becomes the older generation. And that's
Mhm.
sort of the energy that surrounds Ophelia and Grandma Blue. In fact, Grandma Blue, we find out, is has the exact same name as Ophelia, and it's a name that her grandma had. So it's something she's passed down. And it's
Mhm.
also this idea of Derrida has this idea of hauntology, where the past haunts us, and
Yeah.
even the future selves that we imagine haunt us in the present. And so it's kind of a collapse of temporality where at once we are living among, and Grandma Blue keeps having conversations with her ex-husband who's passed away, with her husband who's passed away, and
Yeah.
and seeing her father in the landscape. And so there's this idea of being haunted by things that have passed, but she's also haunted by the future she wants for Ophelia and by the future she wanted for her children that didn't work out, which makes her grip onto Ophelia a little bit tighter. So the river represents that flow of all of those things existing in all of those dimensions all at the same time.
Wonderful. Well, the novel doesn't shy away from the difficult history between Black freeman and Cherokee identity, especially the tension around recognition and bloodline. What responsibility did you feel, if any, in representing that sort of complexity? And how do you see fiction contributing to conversations that are often politically and emotionally charged?
Yeah, well, the first question, which I think is a nice way of saying, how can you write about Cherokee people when you're not Cherokee? And the truth
Mhm.
is, I tried to avoid it in a lot of ways until my editor finally said to me, "Look, we need to go to this reservation and meet these people
Yeah.
because that is the novel you're writing. If you want to write some other novel, fine, but we need to go there." And it's an interesting thing because we have great debates about who can do what. And I was obsessively concerned about representing everyone as real people, and so doing the research and doing the work to make sure that they are three-dimensional and real and not caricatures in any way, shape, or form. That's hard, especially when you're, you know, the book features mostly, the book has Cherokee characters. I'm not Cherokee. The book features everyone is American. I'm not American. Most of the characters are women that speak, and I'm not a woman. So there was a lot of that going on. Um, but that was the story that called, and I feel in art we need to honor that, but also we need to honor the fact that you need to get it right. And so in terms of research, I spoke to many. There are a handful of Black Cherokee scholars
Yeah.
in America. I spoke to all of them. I had an extensive reading list, which was fun. You're an academic, so I'm sure you can appreciate, Claire. The research was almost most of the fun of writing the book, just
Exactly.
learning the stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but always being guided by honoring the people and the traditions that you're representing. I think this is important because I think if we all just write ourselves,
Mhm.
write what we know, as MFA programs tell us all the time,
Yeah.
I think I think we lose the capacity to build bridges. And to your second question, that's what I think um, a book like Black Cherokee represents. It's a bridge between cultures that don't often speak, but often have a lot to offer each other. Because, of course, if, as you said in your introduction, if I'm right, and these are the two great original sins, then those two people have a lot to learn from each other. And the great Canadian Anishinaabe scholar Tanya Talaga,
Mhm.
she says, I draw a lot of inspiration from the Black civil rights struggle in America
Mhm.
because Black folks lived intimately with the slave masters, right? They lived in their house, they nursed their children at their bosom, they
Mhm.
worked side by side. We
Mhm.
didn't. And so they have knowledge. And this is historically true,
Mhm.
especially with the Seminoles, for example,
Mhm.
who would um, who would invite runaway enslaved folks into their space, give them land, give them roles within the tribe, and
Yeah.
there was a deep solidarity there.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I think a book like this can do. It can bridge gaps, but it does require you to have a certain amount of courage, first of all,
Mhm.
because it's a scary time for writers to be writing about anything that's not their own experience, which is why autofiction is so popular, I think. But but you have to do it because someone has to be able to build this space
Mhm.
where both cultures can speak to each other and see each other in a really real way. And it's an incredible act of empathy as a writer because you have
Mhm.
to sort of be in the mind of something you're not. And to me, that is what um, writing really is. That's what fiction is. It's an act um, of audacious imagination. And so I hope I've done it justice.
That's very much true. I do think, Antonia, you have done a great job in fictionalizing someone whose gender is not your own. Reminds me much of D.H. Lawrence.
Me all the canonical comps you want. I'm here for it.
Well, you mentioned Grandma Blue protects Ophelia fiercely, sometimes harshly, because she knows how unforgiving the world can be. The novel suggests
Mm,
that trauma can be inherited, but so is resilience, right? So, in your
mhm.
view, what does healing actually look like in the story? Is it some kind of reconciliation, public acknowledgement, personal courage, or something else?
Yeah, I feel like and part of what I see my role as a writer is not to offer answers, but to ask the right questions, to
Mhm.
offer questions that the reader can then internalize and answer for themselves.
Mhm.
And so I don't think I offer solutions and answers to these questions or reconciliation, but I do think the big questions are obviously what happens to someone who is severed from a community that they belong in, but also what happens to that community. And so Ophelia is severed from the Cherokee community, the Black community, even her own family. She's isolated from. And but what happens to those entities when they do something like that?
Mhm.
When they've excluded Grandma Blue, what happens to the Etsi reservation? When when the Black community sort of treats Ophelia and these other poor girls differently because they're Black, but they're not Black enough. What happens to that community when you do that? And of course, you harm yourself. And of course, how do we heal? And how do we come around to it? So I don't think I have any clear answers. Like I know what it means for me, but I think I'd love for someone to read Black Cherokee, ask all of these questions, and then after, the book is closed, walk off wondering what are those answers for themselves. And that would be success for me as a novelist in this.
Absolutely wise to have an open ending interpretation. So, you mentioned that there are many aspects to the characters in the novel to which you are not. So, how did your own journey inspire the characters in Black Cherokee?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned off the top before we started, we were talking about the psychological nature. I was
Mm-hmm.
complimenting your Freud, Tolstoy, Anna Karenina as Freud psychoanalysis um, episode,
Right.
and you mentioned that I have a very psychological outlook, and I think that's very true. I grew up with an auntie as a teen who was a psychotherapist for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the first books I read, because I would read everything, so I would go on her shelf and read Jung and developmental psychology and Freud, and I was very confused by most of it, but it still seems to have shaped the way I conceive of what a person is. The sort of details of their lives are different than the details of my life.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in every one of those characters, and I think this might be true of all novelists, there's a bit of this our own psyche, a splinter of our psyche in each character. I can see. I asked my friends who know me well which character they think I'm most like, and I get a different answer every time. But I can certainly see in Belle, Ophelia's aunt, Belle, she has a kind of extravagance to her that I see in myself, I can relate to. I think Ayana is a bit of a people pleaser, but also a very boisterous character. I
Mm-hmm.
see that in myself as well. I see the sternness of Grandma Blue in myself. You know, I also grew up with my grandmother as well,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a direct biographical link.
Mm-hmm.
But my grandmother was very different than Grandma Blue. Grandma Blue is stern, rough, and kind of holds it all in.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother was she would sing she was very expressive, and that's how she navigated her. So she would sing, she would pray, she would talk. Grandma Blue is the opposite. As Ophelia says, she only talks about two things, growing food and cooking food, and
Yeah.
everything else is long talking. So
Mm.
I feel there's a splinter of my psyche in every single one of these characters. So um, how I chose who would get what, that's a mystery to me as well. A lot of it is very intuitive, but yes, I can relate to all of them, even though they're all very different.
There's also this intermingling of historical facts, historical factors with fictional elements in your novel. Why do you think exploring history through storytelling is so relevant today?
Well, I think that it's almost like science fiction is interesting and fantasy is interesting because,
Mhm.
I used to be a Star Trek fan and I'm a Lord of the Rings fan. So those might be the ones that your listeners might have Claire's connection with. And there's something interesting because you're like, why put, they've set it in this setting that is not our time. It's referencing times that have gone in the past or prospective future times.
Yes.
And yet the issues they're dealing with are incredibly contemporary. And I think there's something that happens when you situate a story in a either a space or a time that is remote, whether future or past. Um, I think the reader comes into it thinking, "Oh, this is not us. This is not me," and
Mhm.
so they approach it as a kind of with a detached curiosity
Mhm.
that you might, if you think, oh, this is about me and what's going on now, you might have preformed opinions.
Mhm.
Some of it might be directly related to you. You might be triggered. And then all of that emotion prevents you from engaging with the story on its own terms. And
Mhm.
so I think for me, setting it in the 90s, but also, as I said earlier, there are a lot of ghosts from even the more remote past and from actual history that are
Mhm.
haunting them. You certainly feel the haunting of these wealthy Cherokee who had slaves and those times. You feel the haunting of Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act, which moved all the Cherokee and
Yeah.
the other five tribes, the other four
Yeah.
tribes, to on the Trail of Tears. You feel that sorrow. You
Mhm.
feel the Emancipation Proclamation is very big. It echoes, right? It lives
Mhm.
there. And so I think if I'd gone specifically and attached to any one of those things, it we all come with a lot of baggage in how we view those things,
Yeah.
or they trigger things we have a lot of baggage around. So
Mhm.
for me, the fictionalizing is about making it remote so we can think, oh, this isn't us. It's just a nice story. And surprise, so there are questions being asked that actually vibrate in a contemporary way.
Brilliant. Now that we are talking about your writing experience, could you describe your creative process for writing across different genres?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to it. I think talking process is my favorite thing in the whole world. I love it. But
Yeah.
so I won't drown you in a sermon. But one curious thing is that after Saga Boy was done, like it was praised by, you know, um, Casey Lehman, Kinesia Lubrin, like a lot of very well regarded authors praised it. And
Mhm.
so I started writing, and in my head, I'm like, okay, they've all said you're a good writer. So you're a good writer. You got to prove you're a good writer. You can't disappoint them because you are a good writer. And this is, Claire, a terrible approach to writing a novel. Um,
Interesting.
I was trying to prove that I was a good writer, and what became very clear for me is that who we are as a writer,
Mhm.
we have things we want the book to do,
Mhm.
but the book also has something it wants to be.
Mhm.
And what I had to learn with Black Cherokee is that the book has to win because you can't just impose your ambitions as a writer
Mhm.
into a story,
Right.
right? It's the narrative. You have to honor the narrative, honor the characters, and be a servant to the characters. So I stopped thinking of, oh, I'm going to get up and work on my book. I
Mhm.
started thinking of it as gardening because, like Grandma Blue, Grandma Blue helped me through this
Right.
because she's always gardening. But
Yeah.
think about it: when you garden, you don't grow the plants;
Right.
you create the conditions so that the
Mhm.
plant can grow. And that little subtle shift basically influences my process tremendously, where I practice a kind of deep listening to
Mhm.
what the characters in the book want to be,
Mhm.
and I sort of surrender my own ambitions in substance and style. I sort of ignore myself and I let the book serve me. At the end of the day, it's all coming through my imagination. So
Mhm.
I'm there, I'm fully there. But how it shows up, I think the book should determine that. And so that's the biggest switch to my process. And I think it's become fundamental to how I write now. I'm always trying to listen for what is my ego and what is the book. And I'm always trying to choose to honor the book as much as I can.
Wonderful. I heard you have been hosting a national book show. What was that experience like, and how did that experience change your perspective on writing?
Well, I still do. In fact, when we're done, I have to start preparing for my studio day on Tuesday. So,
Wow.
um, yeah. So, the show is called The Next Chapter. It's also a podcast.
Right.
I think of my experience in the last 5 years of writing and publishing. I call it the three educations, the
Mhm.
three literary educations. So, there's the one that you're familiar with, knowing books and loving books and understanding, reading a lot of books and understanding what's possible.
Mhm.
That I draw on that.
Mhm.
The other is understanding the publishing industry, which, although it is very related to the world of books, they actually have very different needs and very different approaches. to literature. Like if you're a really bookish person and you just love the book, when you get to the publishing industry, there are many surprises
Yeah.
that don't align. And then finally, hosting a radio show, talking about books, interviewing authors, talking to readers, just really digging into the bones of reading, why people do it, and what it does for them.
Yeah.
I think what I've learned is that how when people are in the room deciding what book they're going to talk about and what author we're going to bring in,
Yeah.
because there's so many, like there's way too many for us to actually cover all the
Yeah.
books we get. So we have to choose. Well, what criteria do people use for choosing?
Yeah.
That's what I learned in that third education, like sitting in the room and just watching people choose.
Yeah.
And that's been really interesting. And it's actually affected maybe not how I write or what I write about,
Mhm.
but perhaps it affects what I choose to write next is the biggest thing it impacts because you realize how much timing and the zeitgeist of what's happening in the world, but
Right.
also your own personal what you are passionate and most on fire for right now.
Yeah.
That's the thing you need to write, and at any given
Right.
point I have 5 or 6 ideas, and I think hosting a radio show has taught me that, hey, it made it easier for me to choose which one I wanted to write next, if that
Right.
makes sense. Yeah.
If our listeners want to listen to your show, where would they go?
Anywhere you get your podcast that you
Mhm.
wanna listen to, any platform you choose, wherever
Yeah.
you get your podcast, it's the next chapter with Antonio Michael Down.
Great. Well, as we close today's conversation on Black Cherokee, my mind kept drifting back to the river. In the novel, the river is mother, memory, sustenance, and when it is contaminated, it becomes a visible sign of what happens when history is mishandled and when identities failed to be recognized. But healing in this novel is not naive. It is not a simple apology or a legal victory. Healing means something else. It means standing up publicly and claiming what is yours. It means refusing erasure. It means feeling the scar without being devoured by it. And more importantly, to insist that belonging is not determined by fear, but by reading and processing shared memories that make us all survivors. And that is why literature matters. Literature is not an excluded privilege, it is shared experience. It does not belong to institutions alone. Everyone can know literature these days. You don't need a PhD to be able to read James Joyce. You don't need to be accredited in order to claim the identity of a literati, right? And that's the beauty of it. And that is also the freedom we're building. Our platform welcomes new authors, emerging scholars, independent thinkers, storytellers of all kinds to join, share, and weave that vision together. Again, thank you so much, Antonio, for joining the show. Your story has truly been inspiring.
Oh, thank you so much. That is a lovely summary of Black Cherokee and more importantly about books and literature and why it's so critical. I'm a big believer, and so I feel like we are one accord on that. So thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, you can show your support through beyondwords.press/donate so we can keep making academic education in literature accessible to more and more people in the world. Thank you so much for listening.